Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching this LTC, and Warcry just came out with an FAQ. These have ranged the gamut between extremely impactful stuff to just generally quality of life changes. This one is certainly in between, but with at least one change that is pretty groundbreaking as far as how the game is going to work for anyone who's playing under the new rules. So let's get into it. So here we've got the FAQ updated for July, and I'll just go really quick through everything new that's in here, and then I'll talk about the winners and losers in a little bit. First thing is just a change to the alternative terrain rules. This is not what most people play by, but it's a way to alternate placing terrain from two players. And now any part of the terrain feature that's on the ground has to be within 4 inch, or sorry, cannot be within 4 inches of the battlefield edge. The biggest change we've got, though, is to the universal abilities, and that is Rampage. Rampage now reads, this fighter can make a bonus move action up to a number of inches equal to the value of this ability. Before it was just a bonus move action, so they would use their own movement characteristic. Now, it's based on the dice. Then they can make a bonus attack action. I'll talk about the winners and losers later, but this is really interesting. It's reasonable because Rampage has been overpowered for the whole game's existence. Something I've said a lot in videos is, well, this quad ability, I'd throw it out because we don't really care about quad abilities because Rampage is better than all of them. Well, we have a bunch of situations where Rampage is not as powerful. It's going to have some corner cases where Rampage is actually more powerful. So should be pretty interesting. We've also got to change to how objectives and treasure tokens work, mainly just treasure tokens. So I'll just read it out. Objective and treasure tokens are treated as part of the battlefield floor or the platform they are placed upon. Fighters can move over and stand upon objective tokens. That was all true before. These rules also apply to all other markers and tokens that players are asked to place on a specific point on the battlefield. Fighters can move over treasure tokens. Now next part is new. Fighters cannot end a move with any part of their base touching a treasure token. In addition, when measuring distances to and from objectives, treasure tokens, and other markers always measure to and from the center of the marker or token. That part wasn't new, but the idea that no one can end a move with any part of their base touching a treasure token is brand new and will change how you position on the field quite a bit for any fighter that either can't pick up treasure or you didn't want to have holding the treasure. Finally, we just have some very small changes. Crypt of Blood is the much beleaguered, anyone you talk to about Crypt of Blood will tell you that it is a trash set. Other than Goonhammer, weirdly, they put a article out saying how wonderful it was. I just think I actually like every model that's in there, every piece of plastic that's in there. It's just it costs twice as much as it should. God Tier is a game that is somewhat popular in the United States that not sort of played a ton competitively, but reasonably popular, and you see it played at all the conventions. The starter set, you can get it for $45, and you're not playing the full version of God Tier that people play competitively, but you are playing sort of the small, awesome, like starter version of the game. And so if we're going to put out something for Warcry that competes with the $45 version of God Tier, and they've got their own miniatures that are not quite GW quality, but pretty close. We shouldn't be doing it at 100 or more dollars, right? Anything more than sort of 1.5 times what their starter set costs just doesn't make any sense to me. Obviously, doing it a little bit more because GW is selling sort of a premium luxury product, and their whole thing is we have the best miniatures, and that's still true. I get why it would be significantly more, but more than $70 for this Crypt of Blood is awful. And the fact that the ruler it comes with doesn't even work is just so annoying. They actually don't say anything. They just say, please bear this in mind. So maybe you could just say, buy Crypt of Blood so that you get the ruler so that you buff all of your fighters by about an eighth of an inch on their movement. Who knows? Now The only other real change that's here now is to Quester Soulsworn and Royal Beast Flayers. Quester Soulsworn, now they had a quad ability. This one they just nerfed wildly. Now it says choose a friendly fighter with a Stormcast Eternals rune mark within 3 inches of this fighter. Remove that fighter from the battlefield and immediately set them up anywhere on the battlefield more than 4 inches from all enemy fighters. So you can no longer sort of pick up whatever you want. You have to pick up Stormcast Eternals, which I think is too bad. Royal Beast Flayers faction rules now only counts fighters with the Royal Beast Flayers rune mark under pack tactics. That kind of makes sense. Both of these make sense from a fluff perspective, but just make it really hard to bring any sorts of allies in. Finally, they put the Bladeborn Fighters rules as opposed to just saying in the last FAQ, they just said, use the rules as stated in whatchamacallit, publication ages ago and just expected people to go find it. Now it's more clear. People who don't maybe are newer to the game don't have those publications will have an easier time referencing the Bladeborn rules, and so that's a good thing. We've read all of the rules. Let's kind of dig a little deeper into what these actually mean. So let's take a look at the winners and losers. First of the biggest change, which is Rampage. And in my mind, there are two really big winners here. The first is everything big that was move three. Uh, so I'm looking at White Kings. I'm looking at Lords of Plagues. I'm looking at Decimator Primes, Protector Primes. I'm looking at Orc Mega Bosses. I'm looking at, Arcanaut Admirals. Unfortunately, Fire Slayers doesn't have anything really big, but maybe like Warden Kings, things like that. The biggest melee Nurgle Demon, things like that. And the reason for that is these will now be able to rampage a lot of the time. If you roll fours or fives or sixes, they're going to be able to rampage farther than they could before. That's a really big deal. Sometimes when you were running an Orc Mega Boss, if you rolled a triple, it like wasn't really worth it to put your wild dice up to turn that triple into a rampage because if the Orc Mega Boss was your biggest threat, Rampage wasn't really getting you much better than charge. Obviously, you get a whole nother action from it, but sometimes having two doubles or like an extra double instead was kind of better to be able to move it around. Now, if you say roll triple fives or triple sixes, that rampage is looking really, really good. The same is going to be true with all of these move three leaders, and so that's going to be pretty exciting. Is it good for the game? A lot of people were noting that move three fighters are kind of already pretty dominant in a lot of situations. You just get so much for the points in terms of combat stats with these guys. So having just yet another delivery method for them isn't great. I would say personally, when I look at the things dominating the game right now, it's cheap move three stuff and expensive move five and six stuff more generally, or maybe four, five, and six stuff. The more expensive move three fighters, other than the Orc Mega Boss, generally haven't been dominating to the same extent that cheap chaff that's move three has. So I'm not terribly upset about this, but it is a little bit awkward. The other big winner is factions that have their own rampage. So Gloomspite Gitz has it. Stormcast Thunderstrike has it, but only with Annihilators. This is actually interesting where now there's much more debate about whether you'd use Rampage or Force of a Falling Star, because before you were just always going to use Force of a Falling Star. Now you might use Rampage because it can get you a little farther across the board. So that's kind of some really interesting play that you have now. Annihilator Primes are, of course, in the same boat as all the move three leaders, and are, arguably the scariest of all of them in some ways. There's also some factions with sort of very limited rampages that only a couple of their fighters can use. So things like Death on the Wind and Battle Fury are better than Rampage, but only a couple fighters can use them. So would I use a Grimwrath Berserker over, I think the best Fire Slayer leader is a Doomseeker personally. This makes it a lot closer, but I still think I'd probably choose the Doomseeker personally. Harridans, I probably still wouldn't use them over a Gorgai or a Bloodrag Medusa, but this at least gives them some extra utility that's interesting, given that no one else's rampages are nearly as good. And everything in Feck can now get their own rampage is really nice, and I think the Arch region is probably the best at it since with the, or sorry, it's the best choice for this, given that the Vargolf Courtier is sort of a really good leader. I'm doing Death next for my lists for every factions videos, and man, those courtiers are in a lot of the lists I'm writing. And so the Arch Regent kind of has this extra utility of having just as good an attack, but it doesn't have the triple burst damage, but now it can get these nice rampages, which is really good. All of these factions are now going to have pretty significant leverage over other factions in the game that don't have it. I didn't check Chaos or list Chaos under any of these, but a few Chaos factions do also have their own Rampage. There are also some factions with a build your own Rampage sort of situation. For example, the Bone Splitters has sort of a build your own Rampage that was always just essentially strictly worse than Rampage, so you never used it. But now the build your own Rampage factions are much worse than the ones that have an upgraded Rampage, but still better than most other options. So it does sort of stratify these factions a little bit based on, how good of a quad they are. And I think that that was the idea, and I think it'll succeed. Now, I still don't like building around quads, right? Because they only happen in 37% of rounds. I have talked before about how 37 is probably the first number you should learn once you start trying to take, you know, if you want to go to an event in Warcry, learn that 37 number. That is your odds of getting a quad in any situation. And so I wouldn't build around it because that's not nearly often enough, but it will happen in, a little bit more than half your games. So for those situations, it'll be nice to have one of these factions. And so that'd be just a little bit of a buff here for some of those factions that have their own rampage. Is it enough to make a difference? Certainly for Daughters of Cain, no, but for the rest of these, probably moves the needle just a little bit. The losers on Rampage are all the dragons that were in a faction that doesn't have its own faction Rampage. So things like a Morghast Archive, things like Evocator Primes on Dracoline. That was one of my favorite things about having an Evocator Prime was it was a fighter that was really good on its own, but it was a way to kind of build around quads without building around them, where it was great on its own, but it was one of the best Rampagers in the entire game, if not the best. And so when you got a rampage, especially in round one, sometimes if you got a rampage in round one, you would just win because two moves and two attacks, and you would just cripple one of your opponent's deployment zones. Um, can't do that anymore. These are not going to have that same utility, and I think they got a lot worse because of it, especially things like cockatrice, where maybe they're not quite as terrifying in their own right, and they were really sort of leveraging that rampage power quite a bit. They got a lot worse. Also, factions with bad triples. So the issue about having a bad triple and why it hurts so much is let's say you roll a triple and now you're faced with the odds or like the decision of whether you want to add a dice to make a rampage. Well, the factions with good triples, now that rampage has been nerfed quite a bit, if the triple's low or, you won't always be able to leverage the rampage if it's a triple threes, triple twos, something like that. You'll just leave a triple, make another double, and then you'll have a full house and you'll be happy with that, right? Before, it was almost always correct to make a rampage. Now that's not going to be true. So having a good triple is a lot more important because you almost never roll rampages out of natural quads. I think it's 3%. So the odds of rolling a natural triple is 34% of the time. So that's by far most quads that you have in game were from rolling a triple and then upgrading it. And so now in all those situations, you're going to be heavily incentivized to keep your triples unless you have a really good faction quad. And if you don't have a great triple and you don't have a great quad, then that 34% of rolls where you roll a natural triple is actually really painful because you're usually going to be turning that triple in for another double, something like that. Or say for Iron Golems, you know, you're happy to be getting onslaughts on your Ogre Breacher, but rolling a natural triple a lot of the time is just going to be like strictly worse than having rolled multiple doubles, right? So that is something that you're actually going to feel a little bit more than, say, the factions with their own rampages being really advantaged is just the fact that you're just going to have way more triples for a lot of factions here, and if you don't have a good triple, you're not going to keep up. So overall, I think this is a really interesting change. It was made in an odd way. I'm not sure I would have, if I were going to nerf Rampage, I'm not sure that I would have nerfed it that way. But that's okay. I think it was a totally reasonable and interesting defensible choice to nerf Rampage. It was crowding out a ton of other weaker quads, and so now it won't do that quite as much. The fighters here that I've shown on the winners page, if Rampage didn't exist, if we weren't looking at dice at all, these are just better fighters than the fighters that I've got here in the losers section for the most part. Dragons were already not really in the meta much. Actually, Ogre Breachers, Kilobosses, and Evocator Primes are pretty good. I'm not convinced Evocator Primes are any good now, but Ogre Breachers and Kilobosses will still be solid. Let's get on to the treasure page. And the big loser for the treasures is the Chimera. Chimeras are still incredible at treasure missions because they're really fast. They can Dragon Maul a treasure carrier and kill it in one hit. But they got a lot worse because, of course, you can't pick up a treasure with your Chimera. So one of the things you would often do is you would just go sit on a treasure, and now they can't get it, and they can't even come close to it without then being in the Chimera's attack range, and that was a bit of a disaster for your opponent. So now you can't do that, so it's a pretty big nerf to the Chimera, but it's still, certainly one of the five best fighters to be running in the game in treasure missions. Another loser is fast chaff. Anything that's gonna try to race to an objective but sucks at carrying it. So a lot of the move five low wound chaff, where if you were in a treasure mission, you could pick up a treasure if you wanted to, but you weren't really good at it because -2 move brings you back down to 3 move. So really 6 is the magic number for treasure carriers, is so that you only go down to 4. So you didn't really want to be holding a treasure with your Cabalist, but you could still win the race to it and kind of body block them off of it, especially the bigger fast chaff, like cheap fighters that had a base that was bigger than an inch where you could sit on the treasure and then block people coming from a certain direction from touching it. Those no longer can do that, which is kind of too bad. There's a little bit more pressure to have every fighter in your warband being a legitimate treasure carrier if you're looking at playing one of those missions. The other thing was beasts that couldn't carry treasure but could sit on it. So this is kind of halfway in between the monster and fast chaff losers. Things like the Gorehound. Of course, always there's going to be a loser in Corn Demons. Anytime they make a change to the game, Corn Demons lose. So Gorehounds, for example, couldn't pick up treasures, but were really good at guarding treasures, which is kind of fun and flavorful. Now they can't really guard treasures the same way anymore. You still kind of can, you just stand in front of the treasure, but it makes it more difficult. So that's all that's kind of going on with those. There aren't any specific winners to this one. It's more just everyone who's not one of these fighters is a winner, and then these fighters are just mild losers. This isn't going to really change that many games, but it is just something that every once in a while is going to matter, and it's going to hurt fighters like this. Now let's get into the new faction nerfs, and this is so strange. So the translocation thing only affecting Stormcast Eternals really hurts specifically the Kurnoth Huntmaster with the Scythe. If you wanted to build around quads, which you shouldn't, but if you did, translocating a Huntmaster was really, really good because they have to be more than 4 inches away, or the thing you teleport has to be more than 4 inches away from anything. But the Huntmaster could come in 4 inches away and still attack whatever it wanted with the 2 inch reach, etc. It's really only the move 3 1 inch reach fighters that couldn't get an attack in with that rule. So now the Huntmaster is kind of a bit of a loser because that was something that you really wanted to be teleporting. The smaller Huntmaster also because of um, you could still get in and attack with it. The bigger things were generally better for what you wanted to be teleporting. And so Sylvaneth was really the only faction that had big foot sloggers that were more impressive than Stormcast foot sloggers that you would want to teleport. Now you can't do that. Most of the really good options were already in Stormcast though, so you would keep that. The place where it hurts is, Stormcast doesn't have room for a lot of fighters and really doesn't have room for the Knight Relictor, who is not a very offensive threat. So I don't really think that this is ever playable ever now, because you could play a Knight Relictor if you wanted to in Sylvaneth, because Sylvaneth also has cheap bodies, so you could have a Kurnoth Huntmaster as your leader, bring in your Knight Relictor, and there wasn't quite as much pressure on your Knight Relictor to carry your offense because you have all these chaff fighters, so you don't need offense. When you're playing the elite role in a game, you have fewer fighters, so it's harder for you to score points, which means that there is a lot of pressure on you to remove the opposing fighters. And so any kind of expensive fighter that isn't very good on offense, that doesn't have an impressive attack profile, is a bit of a liability in an elite list, but can often, if the ability is good, be really useful in a chaff list. Or if it's just really hard to kill, it can be really useful where you run it up to their scary elite fighters and you actually tie them up for a few rounds and now they're not killing your chaff and you're scoring more points than them and you're off to the races and that's a really good situation. So expensive defensive fighters like the Knight Relictor aren't really playable in Stormcast, which is really too bad because now you can only teleport Stormcast around, which means you just can't play the Knight Relictor from Cluster Soulsworn, which I think is too bad. Royal Beast Flayers, the pack tactics. The only real loser was Bladeborn allies. Because of how pack tactics works, you kind of wanted to flood the board. You were probably going to use your 55-point ghouls anyway. You weren't going to, worry about the one damage from an elite ally there. The only other way to do it would have been to bring in the Sepulchral Guard, bring in the Sons of Velmorn, something like that, to get some bodies that way. Not convinced that that was very good. It is a big nerf to them. So if you were bringing in Sons of Velmorns for other reasons, now which are totally legitimate, the Sons of Velmorn are really good. The Exiled Dead are really good. Now it's a lot less reason to do so because you're not getting pack tactics off them, so you kind of don't want to include them. So there is no winner for either of these nerfs because neither of these factions were good. Quest or Soulsworn are, if not they're probably not the worst faction in the game, but they might be. They're pretty close to the worst faction in the game when you just run them as is. A lot of their fighters are good allies, but the Knight Quester, or sorry, the Knight Relictor is no longer one of those. You cannot play the Knight Relictor. This is probably the worst faction in the game, and so nerfing them for no reason just doesn't make sense to me. Royal Beast Flayers are a little better than that, but they're still not good. So nerfing them makes no sense to me as well. But hey, that's where we're at. And one last change is terrain rules. This rule, kind of silly. No one used it before. I don't think very many people are gonna use it now. But if you do use it, this is a slight winner for cavalry because you now know that you'll have at least one open lane around the side of the board now. Uh, so no matter what, you'll at least be able to get around the board. And as long as you've got 10-inch move, you'll the fact that you're sort of exiled to the sides won't be too big of a deal. I guess you could maybe say that loser is that M3, you know that you're going to have a harder time cutting a direct path through the board now if everyone's just placing terrain in the center of the board and never on the edges. But again, doesn't really matter. No one uses this way of playing because it takes forever. And it's impossible to do at an event. And even in like our casual nights, if you want to play two games, right, you're never going to do this. You're just going to set up the board and you're going to play two games. If you're only playing one game, maybe it makes more sense. But otherwise, no one uses it. So, huzzah! That's all of the changes. I hope you know that this won't really change your Warcry experience a ton. Just Rampage is the big change, and as we've seen, maybe bring out your Gloomspite gifts, but otherwise it shouldn't be too big a deal. So I'll be back with finishing this list video series that has taken me all summer. And until then, may all your rolls be crits.